Hi guys, it's Sophie. So today I'm going to be doing my January wrap up. I know it's a bit late and sorry for that, but hopefully sort of late is better than never at all. So I'm going to start with some of the books I read that I don't have copies of, or that I've sort of listened to or that aren't with me at the minute, just because I can't hold those ones out. So the first one is a book called Legacy by James Kerr, and this is a sort of business book, advice book really, that's based around the sort of careers of the All Blacks and how you can take lessons from what they do in their game into what you do in your business, into what you do in your life. I read this one for work, but it's not a sort of textbook, so I will include it in my sort of Goodreads, and I do read them in my own time. I think it was quite interesting, but I think I didn't know enough about rugby or care enough about the rugby side to make it a really sort of compelling argument. It was interesting, and there are a few things that I've sort of picked up on and are keeping in my head for my work. So there was one sort of example where they were saying the players after every game will sweep out their own stadium, so no matter how big they are or what game they've just won or lost, they sort of clean up and do the rubbish work themselves, and sort of look after themselves, and I quite like that in terms of a sort of business idea. But I give it 2 out of 5 stars overall. If you are interested, I think there are better books out there, but if you have a particular interest in rugby, it might sort of tick some of the boxes for you. So the next one was one I listened to as an audiobook, and that was Chasing the Devil by David Reichert. So this one is a non-fiction book, true crime non-fiction, which I haven't read in a little while, about the Green River Killer. It was quite an interesting one because it was written by the lead detective in the case, so it's a really close examination of the case, and there are some quite sort of personal points in there, sort of showing how the investigation affected the detective and his family and sort of the whole force who were involved in tracking down this serial killer. I think it was very good, the sort of focus on the victim, but also not shying away from the sort of harder details of the case, which I think comes with the experience of sort of being a detective rather than just a true crime writer. I suspect he probably did have some help writing it, just because it reads very similarly to other true crime works I've read, but I don't think that's an issue in and of itself. I think it's still interesting if the information and the sort of stories are coming from this person, and I have no proof that he didn't write the whole thing by himself. But I gave that one 3 out of 5 stars. It didn't do anything new for me, but I think it was a good exploration of that case. If you are interested, then by all means pick that one up. Okay, and the next one I listened to was Them, Adventures with Extremists by Ronson. So I listened to Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed at the very end of last year. I don't think I spoke about that one. But anyway, he's a sort of comedic journalist who goes to sort of all that different areas of the world tracking down his stories, and this one was about him interacting with different extremist groups, so from sort of the KKK, I think was one of the people he spoke with, and people who think that like the Bush family were giant lizards, so it's like just really odd people who have views that we wouldn't consider moderate or normal. I thought certain parts of it were really interesting and really well done, and they remind me a little bit of the Louis Theroux documentaries when he does his like snapshot ones on extremists. I thought it's kind of, that sort of interest, but it wasn't a book, it was very piecey. It felt as though there were lots of articles that were in one place, and whilst there was interest there, I didn't really feel as though it was done very well. It's the first book I've given 1 out of 5 stars to so far this year, and I don't really give them all that sort of freely, but I think clearly he's someone who's established as a journalist, clearly he can write, therefore I'm always going to take that as an aside, like yeah, you're willing and able to write articles, pieces of non-fiction on different topics, but we're judging it as a book, and I just didn't feel like it came together as a book. I think, if they were just articles, I would probably class them a lot higher, but they weren't. So yeah, there's that one. Okay, so the first one I'm going to show you is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a pretty well-known book. I know a lot of people have read it, and I know a lot of people who have spoken about it saying if you know nothing, then don't go away and don't learn anything. So trying to keep up with that for anyone who doesn't know anything about it, I'm going to say the same thing. I'm not going to go through the storyline for you, but sort of what I can without telling you anything about the book. I'd watched the film that's based on this book and didn't realise it because I'd had no one say anything about this book. It didn't click in my head. And then by sort of chapter 2 I thought, I've done this before. Because I've been reading a lot of books recently that are new, I haven't reread an awful lot of books in the last few years, it was actually a really nice experience to read something that I already kind of knew, and I already kind of sort of related to the characters and knew where the story was going to go. And I think that made me enjoy it more, and it's sort of made me feel like maybe I should reread a little bit more. But I really did enjoy the story, and I think probably I preferred the film a little bit, but I think this certainly explores more than the film did. Yeah, I think it was really good. I can't sort of explain what was good about it. I did give it 5 out of 5. It's my first 5 out of 5 for this year, and it's a shame I can't really talk about it more. But I think it's right. I think if you don't know what's going on, but you're interested in sort of strange societies, in manipulation of children, in sort of experimental societies, then this would be of interest to you, but I don't want to say much more than that. And then we have Cujo by Stephen King. It's so ugly, I'm sorry I'm blinding you. Yeah, this is another Stephen King book, therefore I loved it. I'm obsessed with Stephen King. I don't know why, I just am. Everything he writes I seem to love. But this is a story about a dog, and some weird random serial killer he throws in there that never relates to anything ever again, so I think it's just a mistake. Just ignore that part of the story. The majority is about a dog, and a dog who eventually gets rabies and sort of terrorises a town. And it's one of those really well done Stephen King things where you have an element that in everyday life probably wouldn't be that scary or would seem quite manageable, but what happens when it's an individual who's trapped in a situation where it isn't manageable. I love that. That's sort of what I find really enthralling about his writing. And I did really enjoy this one. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It wasn't my favourite Stephen King ever, but I think it was interesting. I read it in one sitting. And if you like horror or thrillers, just read some Stephen King, he's wonderful. Okay, and next I have Wittgenstein's Mistress by David Markson. I'm not going to talk to you too much about this one because I did a full sort of discussion video on this one and on The Familiar Part 2, which is the one I read sort of at the first book of this year. And I'm not going to talk about The Familiar either, but I'll link the video down below for both of those. So it's there, my thoughts are there, on a much more full setting than I'd be able to give here. And the next one I read was The Trial by Franz Kafka. I quite enjoyed this one, but I didn't enjoy it half as much as I thought I was going to. I did find pieces of it quite boring. It essentially follows a man who's wrongly accused of a crime and follows him through the sort of bureaucratical system that he's in, and how that once he's in the system it's very difficult for him to prove his way out of the system, if at all. The sort of message behind it I found really interesting. I just don't think I liked the delivery all that much. There were really weird female characters in it, and again it was sort of a really weird relationship with these female characters and how they seem to just turn up and just want sex and then run away again. It was just a bit odd. So it was a sort of book for me because bits were a bit boring, but the message was interesting. The writing mostly I found boring. But there are sort of pieces where I was like, oh, that's a really nice turn of phrase. Yeah, not my favourite book in the world, to be perfectly honest. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because it is sort of down the middle. Some things I liked, some things I didn't. If you're interested, then pick it up and have a read, but I don't think it's the most thrilling thing you're ever going to read. It took me a while to get through it and it's not very big. And then the next one I finished was Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This one I gave the same rating, but I liked much more than I liked The Trial. I think maybe I should switch The Trial down or this one up. But this is a story about a man who is sort of a nothingness in his society, and he lives in what he would consider to be the underground. And it's about his sort of dissatisfaction with society and the way that society functions, in that there are people he deems to be really privileged and sort of all-powerful, and there are people like him who are just trodden down into the dirt. There's a scene where he's sort of trying desperately to impress these people he wants to be his friends, and he just realises he can't he has no idea what he's doing. He doesn't know how to play the game to make them like him or to make him of interest to them, and he becomes a kind of laughing stock. It's really a sort of conversation from the underdog almost, and it is a little bit like a manifesto in a way. When I was reading, I did think like this is the kind of thing I could imagine reading as a manifesto, and yes, I've read some manifestos because I'm interested in true crime. I've read a few, and it's that similar sort of like very negative, very woe is me, but with something to back it up. So he sort of becomes obsessed that this man is trying to bump into him on the street, and he seems like he's just lost it, but it's completely plausible that this man could be trying to knock into him on the street. It's only a really little book, and the writing is quite interesting. I think the style was much more interesting than I found Kafka's, and some nice sort of turns of phrase and ideas, very philosophical in terms of sentences. You could pull a lot of them out and use them on their own, I think. Okay, and the next one I have is Hiroshima by John Hersey. This one I spoke a little bit about when I hauled it, which was very recently, and it's essentially about the bombing of Hiroshima. It was a really well done book. I think there are more thoughts on it are in the last haul I did, so I'll link below to whichever video it is that I spoke about that, because I'm pretty sure I'd read it already by the time I spoke to you guys about it. But it was really interesting, and really new sort of perception of Hiroshima for me. It humanised it as well for me. I think reading about the particular people who've been there through their sort of stories, rather than just reading about it as a tragedy, it brought it quite close and into focus. So if you're interested in non-fiction, if you have 2 minutes to spare, then have a go. I think this one is good and interesting. And then on a similar theme, it is Gods of Metal by Scholsser. So I spoke about this one as well in the same video, but hadn't read it yet. This one I think I found even more interesting. It was something I knew nothing about, and something that did sort of take me back. I've told a few people about it since I finished reading it, and I think that's the sign of a good non-fiction book, when you want to tell everyone else what's happened. So it's essentially about the American nuclear warheads and the security surrounding them. So if any of you have watched Orange is the New Black, you know the nun in that, I can't remember what she's called, but the nun in that is that sort of peacekeeping nun, and they lock her up and all she ever wants to do is to protect everyone. Well, it turns out that there's a real nun, and that's who Piper Kerr based her character on, is this woman who's in this book, who used to go around these nuclear sites and peacefully protest, because the security is so poor. Like, there was one base where they had all of their passwords on all of their doors set to default, like literally like 00000, because no one thought to change it, and these are like weapons that could change the whole world. Obviously it's a bit different now, they've managed to beef security up since people have sort of figured out that that's happening, but it's just mad how we let it get to that stage, and it just shed some light on the nuclear issue. In terms of nuclear weaponry, I personally, I'm very pro-nuclear energy and anti-nuclear weaponry. I understand the links between the two, and that if you've got somewhere that's processing rich uranium, then someone might nick a bit for their own nefarious uses. But I'm not anti-nuclear. I think it needs to be controlled and used in a sensible and appropriate way. But this just shows when it isn't used in a sensible and appropriate way, and all the horrible ways it could go wrong. So whether you are pro-nuclear weaponry, or sort of anti completely, I think it's quite an impartial sort of view of the nuclear issue, but certainly talks about the security of the weaponry. So feel free to go and read this one. I think this is probably the more interesting of the two to me, just because it's something I hadn't ever touched on before. Okay, and the next one I have is The Dumb House by Burnside. I completely agree with all of the booktubers who have sung this book's praises. It's absolutely wonderful, and the writing is beautiful. It's one that I read in one afternoon, and I read it with a red pen and a ruler in my hand to underline and keep the pieces I like the most. It's an absolutely beautiful book on a really disturbing topic, which is one of the things I really enjoy sort of reading. If you haven't heard already, and I'm sure you have because lots of people have spoken about it, it's about a man who sort of decides that the way to get to the soul or the sort of essence of humanity is to sort of mute people, to try and make it so they aren't using language, and to see what language happens or occurs naturally in a vacuum without the influences of media or other language or any kind of vocal patterns at all, really. And it leads to some quite disturbing experiments that he does, trying to replicate that and trying to create an opportunity to observe that. But the book itself is absolutely gorgeous. Like, I wasn't expecting to find such poetic language here. I thought that it would be probably slightly more archaic, probably slightly more sort of a gothic style, I suppose. And just, yeah, I really wasn't expecting it to be so poetic and so fresh. I think the writing was really vibrant and really alive. So if you are interested in it and you've been holding off, I'm just going to add my recommendation to the pot with everyone else's, and hopefully we can get more. This was my second 5 out of 5 star book of 2016, and I will be reading more of his work. I absolutely loved it, and will certainly be picking more things up by him and seeing if I enjoy them too. Okay, so the next one I have is Girl at War by Sara Nović, and this is an exploration of the childhood of a girl who grew up in Croatia at the time of the sort of large-scale conflict that was going on, and you know, Serbia's gone mad as well, and it's sort of this really violent upbringing, this really violent childhood, where you have sort of going from quite a peaceful setup to suddenly no one's really safe, and your whole neighbourhood isn't safe, and you can't even go to find medical care from the nearest doctor without worrying about whether over the border there'll be someone who's willing to kill you. It's about her childhood in that situation, and then about her sort of budding adulthood in the United States, where she's taken as a sort of refugee, I suppose, by the UN when they find out what's happening with her in her life. I think the contrast between the two worlds was what made it particularly strong for me. I would have quite happily read along, not happily, but you know what I mean, I would have read along the first half of her life and seen her grow up in that sort of state and thought like, oh my goodness, isn't it awful what happened here? I think in a way, because it brings it over to the States, it grounds it a little bit for me, which isn't ideal, but I think it does. I think it relates it to something where I can say, oh blimey, like this is what's happened to her, and then these are her peers, that these people who have, you know, maybe not perfect lives, but white picket fence lives, if you know what I mean, and that comparison. So I think it was really powerful. I think the writer is also Croatian, or did live in Croatia, so I think there's a sort of link there with the conflict and wanting to explore it a bit. I have to admit I knew nothing about the conflict, that it even existed, before I picked this book up, and I think at some stage in the future I will try and learn a bit more about it, because it's a little bit awkward how little I seem to know about history and what goes on in the world. And then the next one I have is A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Eleanor McBride. This book is terribly sad. I know everyone likes it so much, and I did enjoy it, but it really is sad. It really does sort of hit you over the head a little bit. And the writing style is very strange, it's very disjointed, it's very childlike, in a bit of an opposite way of the way The Waves deals with an adult voice throughout, despite the childhood. This deals with a child's voice throughout, despite her having grown up. So the story is about this woman who's dealing with sort of her life after her brother's had a brain tumour when he was a young child. And we start off with them being very young, we start off with them in school, and it sort of goes through and she's growing up and he's growing up and the whole family is sort of expanding. But you keep in this very naive, very strange sort of writing style throughout. It's not a happy story at all. There are no sort of moments there where I felt as though there was going to be anything really good come for this family. And I don't think it was just a complete sort of whitewash of negative emotions, because it was interesting to read the writing style, but I don't think that I necessarily got all that much from it in a sort of positive sense, but I think the book itself was good. Nearly there now. So the second to last one I have is Young Skins by Colin Barrett. This book is a book of short stories, and they're all set in Ireland, in a sort of smallish town, kind of similar size to the one I live in, I suppose. But so it's not a city by any stretch, but it's got sort of a bar, a club. So small town island really. I didn't really like this collection all that much. There are a couple stories I did enjoy, but the majority were just not that brilliant to me. They were all sort of quite similar in a way. They all mostly sort of reflected around a young man's experience of Ireland and of the culture and of what was sort of thought of him, which just doesn't particularly click with me, but maybe someone else would really enjoy this one. And then in contrast to the last short story collection that I didn't like, I have The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which was I think one of the first books I read this month, but I really enjoyed this one. It's another short story collection. They're all sort of around that duality of Nigeria and Africa as a continent versus America as a continent, and how the sort of two cultures relate and what things are missing in a way from both. A bit about sort of the expectations of immigration, the attitudes of sort of Westerners or I guess sort of locals to an area to immigrants, especially when they first arrive. So that was really interesting, and again, Nigeria isn't something I know anything about really. I've never been to Africa at all. The stories themselves were beautifully well formed and just gorgeous, like a real sense of a really great storyteller, if that makes sense. But I think this was a really nice sort of dip in and dip out, I suppose, of her writing style and seeing what she can do in her work. I like starting with short story collections before reading novels, so if you're the same as me, then I think this one is definitely worth a shot. So I hope you're all well. I'm sorry for the super long video, just didn't feel like breaking it in half today, and I will see you soon in my next video. Alright, bye bye.